G'day, it's Jamie, and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today, I'm reading an old bush yarn written by Majuba about the continuing adventures of Levitt, Mac, and Bismarck in far north Queensland. So we'll get into it. This was published in Melbourne's Leader on Saturday, the 18th of November, 1899, titled Wayfaring Prospectors by Majuba. It is strange that certain fields, barren in all save surface indications, obtain a fascination for the miner, and the difficulties attendant upon reaching them, and when reached in working, throw a glamour over prospects which in any other place would be unworthy of consideration. The fields of the extreme north have seen more gold sunk in treasure seeking than was ever been won from them, and have been responsible perhaps for more hopeless failures than any other locality. In the haphazard methods employed by alluvial miners in that part, luck was a great factor, for the country and formation were unlike any that had hitherto been familiar with. As the miner's proverb expressed it, experience goes for nothing north of the Burdekin, and certainly indications considered infallible in other parts were no sure guides to success in the northern fields. But luck falls not to all, and the party, which had prospected Cape York for some months with ill success, determined to delay no longer among its desolate ranges, but to push forward to the Tintawarri, of the richness of which field they had heard glowing accounts. Their horses needed no mustering, for sandflies, those pests of tropical Australia, had arrived in myriads, and all day the horses stood with their heads over smouldering fires, which the miners lighted for them, careless of burns as long as they could keep their bodies enveloped in smoke. At night they fed down the flat, but here the sunrays came galloping back, driven half mad by the insects before the fires could be again set going for them. Recent events made the prospectors loath to linger, and their arrangements were soon made. The 5-horse dray brought out and loaded, and with Levitt riding in the leader's pilot, they left the camp, which long occupation had rendered almost a home to them. Crossing unoccupied country with no track to guide the traveller, though rife with difficulties and vexations, it's full of interest and novelty. The fact of not knowing what the day may bring forth, what the country ahead will be like, and the thought that no white man perhaps has ever trodden that path before, gave a zest to the day's marching not experienced when following a beaten track. The changing features of the country, the wild creatures met with, and the sight of trees and shrubs new to the eye are all absorbing to the love of nature. To draw into camp by some reboarded lagoon as the sun declined, and when horses were loosed and with clanging bells feeding around the dray, to take a shotgun and topple over a couple of ducks as they rose rocket-like from the water lilies, was a pleasure unknown to dwellers in towns. And then the meal of fresh damper, ducks split and grilled on the coals, and a smoking pot of tea, what could seem better to appetites sharpened by the day's constant travelling? But the journey was not marked only by these pleasant features. Difficulties were frequent, nor was danger entirely absent. The open forest had given place to grassy plains, from which pyramid-like peaks rose from a tangle of dead scrub which surrounded their feet. Passing on one of these isolated peaks, Bismarck, who was riding on top of the loaded dray, marked a scrub turkey on the edge of the jungle disappear into its depths with a peculiar trailing motion assumed by that bird when near its nest. The scrub turkey, one of the family of megapods of mound makers, buries its eggs in great heaps composed of decayed leaves and other debris. One mound serving for many birds. The eggs are a delicacy, and as a nest sometimes contains as many as 40, it is well worth the trouble of searching for. Bismarck called upon Mac, who was walking beside the leaders, to halt, and catching up his double barrel, he slid down from his perch and followed the bird. The turkey rose again before him and scrambled off with drooping wings, and so true to the nature of its motions, the German fancies that it had really met with some mishap and would be easily caught. Forgetful of all else, he pressed forward in pursuit. Breaking through a mass of vines, he found himself close upon the bird, entangled apparently in the coils of a great twisted supplejack, which wound sinuously around the stem of a prickly pine tree. He threw himself forward and stooped to grasp of the bird, but, to his intense surprise, the great supplejack rose with a writhing movement, and here the hunter had no time to rally his wits. He found himself enveloped in its folds. Vainly he tried to free himself, and the pain of the close embrace and terror, inspired by he knew not what, caused him to cry for help. And assistance was at hand, for Mac, fearful that his companion would again lose his way, had followed close upon his footsteps. In the north, the python, commonly known as a carpet snake, grows to an immense size, specimens having been killed measuring 30 feet in length. Although not venomous, these large boas are exceedingly powerful, and though they will, if possible, avoid man, yet if one happen to come in contact with its writhing body when in the act of crushing its prey, he is likely to find himself locked in an embrace from which, unaided, it is impossible to get free. The object which Bismarck had mistaken for a supplejack was a python of great size, and coming upon it suddenly, had without warning become enveloped in its folds. As Mac arrived, the reptile was uncoiling its great length from the tree, and, with the head twisted around until it faced the German, was darting out a forked tongue from beneath open jaws, armed with 2 formidable rows of teeth. Lifting the gun dropped by Bismarck in his panic, Mac levelled it at the reptile's head and pressed both triggers. At the double discharge, the python drew back its shattered head and, straightening its body with a convulsive movement, cast the terrified man into a thicket of lawyer vines, where he lay gasping and moaning, with ribs aching from pressure which had lately undergone. Though actually not much worse than his rencontre, Bismarck had received the greatest fright he had perhaps ever experienced, and his nerves were severely shaken. This, together with the shame he felt at having again so blindly run into danger, caused him to anticipate with dread the rallying which he knew Levitt would give him. He begged Mac to conceal his adventure, and to this the Scot, with a good-humoured laugh, consented. The turkey, the cause of this mishap, now lying crushed to death, he looked upon with aversion. But Mac, not sharing this feeling, carried off the bird. Dejectedly, Bismarck followed back to the dray, where they found Levitt awaiting them. Levitt was too much elated by a discovery he had made to notice the bird, or inquire the cause of the delay. He had seen in the distance a chain of hills with the formation of which he was familiar, and felt sure that they were approaching the main track to Tintawarry. He urged them to push forward with all speed, hoping before nightfall to reach the Baroom River, where he expected to find an encampment of other whites. There is so little to recall a busy world when travelling over uninhabited country that the bushman scarcely realises the loneliness of his situation. But on coming suddenly out of the trackless forest onto a great main road, the thought of from how much he has been cut off strikes him keenly. The scene, though perhaps unoccupied by trade at the time, bears evidence of a great bustling world with which he feels he has been gradually losing touch. Before him stretches the beaten highway, cut up by long lines of wheel tracks. Empty cans and bottles strew the roadside, and at intervals trampled camping places, cumbered with jagged tree stumps and white heaps of ashes, break into the sombre boarding of virgin forest. With feelings of satisfaction mixed in with vague regret, the travellers once more encountered signs of civilization striking the main track to the Tintawarry. Whenever on a new route, a tempting camping place occurs, with permanent water and good feed at hand, the shanty keeper plants his modest building of timber or canvas ostensibly to provide refreshment for travellers, in reality to gather a harvest from those reckless revellers of which conditions of life in the bush turn out such a plentiful crop. A few casks of liquor of doubtful concoction, a few dozen of tin pannikins, and a rough counter are all the stock in trade he requires, and if possessed of a disposition sufficiently unscrupulous, he is in a fair way to quickly accumulate competence. As the travellers approached the river, the first thing to attract their notice on the road sign was a new building of rough timber topped with a roof of reeds, and from amongst the debris of chips and shavings which littered the foreground rose an unbarked pole bearing the sign of the Baroom Hotel. From the building issued sounds of merriment, and as the dray rumbled past to the camping place on the riverbank, the puffy figure of the landlord appeared at the door and hailed the miners with an invitation to alight. But wishing to get their horses onto feed without delay, they declined, calling to him that they would look him up and hear his news later on. Picking a suitable spot some distance from the many tents which clustered in the angle of the river and road, they hobbled their beasts and, having suppered, retraced their steps to the hotel. Among other customs now fast dying out, it was usual for a bushman, on entering a public house for a spree, to hand over the cash or gold in his possession to the landlord for safekeeping, the latter being understood to keep a fair tally on the amount spent from day to day. But as his customer was dead to the world for half this time, there was no check on the landlord's cupidity, and very often, after allowing the reveller to spend a moiety of the amount, he would tell him that his money was all cut out and that he must either produce or clear. Some shanty keepers, indifferent honest, prided themselves upon acting fairly by trusting bushmen, and, as it was to their interest that the money, often a large sum, should all be spent in the house, they encouraged the bushman to stand treat to all comers. Cogan, the landlord of the Baroom Hotel, was one of the honest kind, and as the three prospectors entered, he greeted them accordingly, for, as the sequel will show, certain qualms were troubling his conscience, and he wished on that night to have as many thirsty mortals in his bar as he could conveniently gather. "Come on, gentlemen," he began, as the mates paused to scan the occupants, in the hopes of finding some old acquaintance. Come on, you're just in time. Free drinks is going tonight, and Mr. Billings is shouting. Mr. Billings, the generous reveller in question, was seated, motionless, on an upturned cask at the back of the bar, his back propped up by the shelves behind, and his hat tilted forward so as to conceal his whole face, fast asleep apparently, and unconscious of all that was passing around him. But the sight of the man's money being spent thus, liberally by proxy, was such a common one in the bush shanty that prospectors felt no scruple in refreshing themselves at the expense of one who could have no participation in the jollity. And the other callers, finding the situation much to their taste, scorned, disposed to give the shanty keeper every assistance. "I drinks to your health, mate, and to our better acquaintance," said a little Cockney bullock driver, bowing with a mock gravity towards the sleeping man, "and I hopes I'll be handy when next ye feels dispoged for a little rollification. By Ginger Bloomy Davy," he continued, turning to his neighbour, "Billings is what I calls a perfect gentleman." "Is he be a proper man," replied Davy, a big Cornish miner, looking into his empty pannikin. "Gie a nudge, landlord, and wake him up. Us be willing to drink his health again." Kagan took the hint. "Pass up your points, gents. Mr. Billings is doing it, but you don't for to disturb him. Nothing riles him so much, being checked door and a nap. It's only thing us make. I'm turning Jack Smither." The threat conveyed by the last remark, a Jack Smither, is one who never stands treat, had a desired effect. The men withdrew their attention from the recumbent figure and, their tongues being loosened, fell to the pranks usual in a bush barroom. The noise became deafening, some singing, some relating endless yarns which found no listeners, and others, pugnacious in their camps, challenging the universe. At intervals, the glasses were being replenished at the expense of the unconscious man, but at length, to the surprise of all, Kogan, not content with the depletion of his rum kegs, produced a case of champagne, and popping off the corks, poured the liquor into pannikins with the reiterated call, "Draw up, gents, Billings is doing it." "I say, ain't this coming in rather strong?" said Levitt, refusing the proffered can. "Why, this game would break the luckiest man on the field, and him sewed up too." Kagan only shook his head mysteriously. "Do he always sleep like dot?" asked Bismarck. "Mein Gott, will nothing's wake him?" The question received no reply, for the noise had increased to a perfect pandemonium. The shouting crowd, many flourishing half-filled pannikins, were surging round two disputants whose heated argument had ended in blows. One of the pugilists found himself worsted, suddenly stooped, and diving through the encircling crowd, took refuge behind the bar. His antagonist, not to be thus balked, burst through a pursuit and began to clamour over the counter. Springing back to avoid his grasp, the fugitive came in contact with the sleeping man, and next moment, man and cask were rolling on the floor. While some strove to separate the combatants, others, led by Levitt, passed round to the back of the counter to aid the shanty keeper in raising his fallen guest, whom even the shock of the fall had failed to awaken. Kogan, anxious to hide the man's face, replaced the fallen hat and pressed it down. But as many willing and not overly steady hands raised the body, the hat again slipped, disclosing features leaden and swollen in death. The laughter changed to silence, as with looks of consternation. The men allowed the rigid body to drop back, where it lay, with glassy eyes staring upwards. A thick black stream of blood oozed from their shen lips and crawled across the boards. "My God," exclaimed Levitt, "the man's dead, and what's more has been for hours. Why, what's your game?" he continued, turning to the shanty keeper. "What in thunder's meaning of it?" "Ugh, what for you play such jokes on travellers," said Bismarck, "sticking up dead mans on the cask, on cracking he was fast shouting." The big Cornishman stepped forward and, dropping a huge hand on Kagan's shoulders, shook him roughly. "Spit it off, little man. Let we uns hear what's the racket. If it's murder, you'll like to go up quick." The shanty keeper, with a depreciating glance round the ring of threatened faces, began to expostulate. "S'help me, Bob Jebs, it's all square." "Stop," cried Levitt. "Let's have a jury of the whole room, and all regular, before we hear him. Draw up, chaps, and give your attention. Now, Kogan, you was going to explain. The straight truth's your best game." "I never meant no harm in deceiving you, gents," began the shanty keeper, "and I think when you all hears what I got to say, you'll give me credit for being honest at least. This cove Billings come here last week, and giving me his money, £150 it were, he settled down to fill himself decent like, shouting for all as turned up and conducting himself altogether like a gentleman, putting on no frills but taking his liquor quiet. I never seen no signs of sickness on him, but when he come to the bar this morning, he drops down sudden, and afore you could say Jack, he expired. Now, most coves in my line had put him under the ground straight away and collared the balance of his cash, but ain't my way. I'm honest man, gents. I don't want to rob him, no man. So I says to myself, he'll keep another day, and there's a thirsty crowd on the creek. I'll set him up on an empty cask back of the counter where he can see his balance spent in a way as he'd like. I've kept regular accounts, as I can show you, and as I reckon our deal's about square, I can put him under the sod with clear conscience tomorrow. That's the whole truth, so help me Bob. What else could I do, being, as I said, an honest man?" As Kagan's tale proceeded, the stern faces round him relaxed, and he repeated his protestation of honesty. A laugh, despite the gravity of the situation, went round the room. Satisfied that there had been no foul play, the men separated, leaving the bar in little lots with spirits sobered by the sudden discovery. Levitt and his mates walked for a while in silence, a silence which Bismarck, who nothing could long repress, at length broke. Vel, he reflected, to see what may happen to a man in this country. Tiff like a brute and die like a brute is the fate of many. But to become after death the medium of saving the conscience of a poisoning shanty keeper is an ending that I pray heaven may defend me from. The end. Oh, I like that story. That's pretty cool. And unfortunately, that's the last story that I found in the adventures of Bismarck, Mac, and Levitt. Okay, that's it from me. I'll get back to this all next time. Bye.